My name is Guy Gunderson. I'm the supervisor archivist here at the library. Tonight's program, featuring Ira Shapiro, author of The Last Great Senate, is being taped by Michigan Productions for later broadcast on Ann Arbor Cable. So I'm in charge of housekeeping because of that. So before we roll the tape, let me just go over a few reminders. First, please turn off or silence any and all cell phones. Thank you. Second, when we get to the Q&A session, we ask that you please go to the microphone in the back of the auditorium in the center aisle. That way the audience will be able to hear you when you ask your question, but more importantly, your family and friends can hear you on the future broadcast audio. That is channel 22 on Ann Arbor Cable, in case you're wondering. This evening's program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration with additional funding from the Ford Presidential Foundation. We are very grateful to members of Friends of Ford and contributors to the foundation for their ongoing support for our educational programs, research grants, and public programs. And following tonight's program, we actually do have copies of The Last Great Senate for sale, and our speaker will be signing copies of his book at the reception after the program. Now I would like to present archivist Donna Lehman, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Guy. We're very pleased to have you with us for our third lecture this fall. Tonight, we have the honor of hosting Ira Shapiro, an esteemed attorney, politician, and now author. Now, the excitement of working in the Senate began for our guest in 1969 when he spent the summer serving as an intern for New York's Senator Jacob Javits. After receiving his law degree from the University of Pennsylvania, he returned to Washington and the Senate, serving in a wide range of senior positions, including Chief Counsel of the Governmental Affairs Committee and Chief of Staff to West Virginia's Senator John D. Rockefeller IV. He was General Counsel to the Office of the United States Trade Representative and played a critical role in completing the negotiations which established the World Trade Organization, as well as the North American Free Trade Agreement. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Shapiro served as a trade negotiator, earning the rank of ambassador. He currently practices trade law in Washington, D.C. at Greenberg Traurig, where he is focused on World Trade Organization disputes and market access barriers around the world. Now, earlier this year, Mr. Shapiro released his book, The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. The book reflects his passion for what's been called the world's most exclusive club and presents a portrait of the statesmen and women who helped steer America during the crisis years of the late 1970s. As Americans head to the polls, Ira Shapiro provides readers with a unique history lesson, enabling us to make choices with context and perspective. In Mr. Shapiro's own words, this election season and the widely shared public interest in Capitol Hill makes it an ideal time to talk about the challenges facing our political system. I think we all agree with that, and so let us please welcome Ira Shapiro. Thank you very much.
I often edit my bios depending where I am. Some of my trade negotiations are not always that popular everywhere else. But thank you, Donna, for the kind introduction. I thank Elaine and Gaia and the library for giving me the opportunity to come here today. I've had the opportunity to speak at the Kennedy, Clinton, and Carter libraries So this is in the spirit of bipartisanship. I'm glad to be here. Donna mentioned that I was an ambassador, and I was very proud of the work I did in the Clinton administration, but the truth is that the most important thing about being an ambassador was a personal thing to me. When I was appointed, my son at that time was 15, and any of you that have had teenagers remember it's not always the easiest time. And I was traveling too much, and we weren't spending that much time together. So I really worked very hard to spend as much time as I could with him. And so one day I was driving him and a friend to a soccer game, and there's like dead silence in the car. Like it couldn't be more dead. Nothing I do or nothing I said could get the conversation going. It was not like driving my daughter and her friends. So the silence is going on, and all of a sudden, there's a voice from the back seat. My dad's an ambassador. And then silence. But they didn't give him a country. More silence. Then, but if Clinton's reelected, they may give him a country. But he won't take it because I have to finish high school. And it was so wonderful to hear him speak. And it was also very wonderful to find out that he actually had some sense of what I was doing. So I've never really forgotten that. At dinner we were discussing President Ford, and I got to Washington in time to work with the Ford administration in 1975 and 76. I never knew President Ford, but I think all of us who came of age at that time always admired President Ford for his great public service and intelligence and integrity, and what he did for our country after the long national nightmare of Watergate. So it's a real treat to be here. President Ford also was sort of a charter member of the greatest generation, the World War II generation that came back after the war, went into public service, and led our country in a very difficult time. And I'll touch on this because I think an element of what was great about the Great Senate was indeed that it was a product of the World War II generation, that great generation. President Ford, of course, his centennial is next year, as many of you know. The other person I want to mention who was a contemporary, whose centennial is in December, was Senator Philip Hart of Michigan. I got to the Senate in time to be able to work a little with Phil Hart and to see Phil Hart on the Senate floor in the last year of his life when the cancer was obviously ravaging him. Phil Hart epitomized what I call the Great Senate in many respects. He was a man of uncommon courage who came out of World War II where he had been injured in the D-Day invasion very seriously. And despite the injury, he refused to go home, and he went and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Then he came back to Michigan and was instrumental in building the Democratic Party after World War II, along with Soapy Williams and others. Phil Hart became a senator in 1958. He embodied the progressive impulse of that time, but he also embodied the greatness of a senator. He was regarded as the conscience of the Senate. He was loved not just because he happened to be progressive in a progressive time. He was loved because of the content of his character. He was extraordinarily fair-minded, and they named a building after him, the Hart Senate Office Building, because he was that esteemed. And so it's a treat for me to be in Michigan to think about Phil Hart just a few weeks before his centennial. Let me tell you where the book came from. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the book and then get on to, hopefully, the relevance of the book to our current day. I spent 12 years in the Senate. It meant a lot to me. And I worked with the greats, the near greats, the ungreats, and the ingrates. And there were a lot of greats, but there were a few others. I was out from there from 75 to 87. Fast forward to 2008. During the presidential election with Barack Obama and John McCain and Senator Hillary Clinton, a group of us who had worked together 30 years before came together regularly to have breakfast. And we would talk about the presidential campaign and how exciting it was. And eventually we would talk, our minds would go back to the Senate, how it had been wonderful to work in, and how it had become completely unrecognizable to us. Polarized, paralyzed, dysfunctional. And I came out of one of those breakfasts and decided I would try to write a book about the Senate that I remembered, the Senate when it was great. Now, when you do something like that, or undertake to do something like that, there's a couple of threshold questions that arise. Was it really great? Did it only seem great because I was there? Did it only seem great because I was young? And that was a while ago. Memory can play tricks on you, and everyone has a tendency to believe that when they're somewhere, it's the golden age. Fortunately, the research turned up the right conclusion. From the early 60s through 1980, for a period of almost 20 years, America had a great Senate. The Senate of Phil Hart and Hubert Humphrey and Ed Muskie and Howard Baker and Bob Dole and Jacob Javits, Mike Mansfield, Sam Ervin and Bill Fulbright, great senators whose names still resonate in the country and in their states. The Senate was at the forefront of everything during that period. The civil rights legislation, the opposition to the Vietnam War, holding President Nixon accountable during Watergate. You can't think of an issue where the Senate wasn't at the forefront. And it was a period of time when we had 5 consecutive presidents, none of whom served 2 full terms. It was a period, as we remember, of assassination, of war, of political scandal, of all kinds of difficult things for America, and the Senate was in the forefront of trying to help guide the ship of state forward. Turns out I discovered something that was in plain sight but hadn't been noticed. If you Google the words Great Senate, you will find nothing other than my book. I don't think the words had ever been used together. There are great Senate filibusters, there are great senators, but the notion that there was actually a great Senate had never been thought of. And after I wrote the book, there were a bunch of reviews that was saying, well, we have a terrible Senate today, but back in the 1960s and 70s, we had a great Senate. And I was thinking, yeah, they hadn't noticed it until now, but that was good, because it was a great Senate. Now, it's important to differentiate that Senate not only from what we have today, but from everything that came before it. Because for most of the 20th century, the Senate was a drag on the nation's progress. The Senate was a body for obstruction. It was dominated by the Southerners who had the seniority, who controlled the committees. There was a time when 8 committees, 4, including the 4 major ones, were chaired by senators from exactly 4 states: Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, and Arkansas. Robert Caro referred to the Senate as the South's unending revenge for Gettysburg. The only place where the South did not lose the Civil War. That changed. In the late 50s, it started to change when Phil Hart got to the Senate in 1958. It changed. Lyndon Johnson picked up the Senate kicking and screaming and moved it into the 20th century. But it really only changed in the early 60s when we had a progressive president in John Kennedy. We had more and more progressives elected to the Senate. 50 years ago, I was just giving an interview because of George McGovern's death. 50 years ago, next month, George McGovern came to the Senate, along with Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut, Birch Bayh of Indiana, Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, Dan Inouye, who's still there, from Hawaii, and a young man struggling to make his reputation on the backs of his brothers, Ted Kennedy. When those people got to the Senate became great, and it took off for an 18-year period. So what made it great? The first thing, which I touched on before, is it was the greatest generation. Tom Brokaw doesn't need any footnotes from me, but the truth is that the people like Phil Hart, who came back from World War II, some of whom with crippling injuries like Hart and Inouye and Dole, those people had character, courage, a sense of shared purpose. They didn't think the hardest thing they would ever do was cast a vote that was difficult. They had done some things already, having gone ashore at Normandy and Battle of the Bulge. They had a sense of shared national purpose. They had a commitment to the country and a faith in government and a belief in politics. They also, having seen the strength of America, many of them were prepared to rectify its weaknesses, particularly discrimination against black Americans. They came back and became the party builders in their states, and they rose to the Senate. And then, when they were there, World War II, of course, led almost immediately into the Cold War. And that sense of shared national purpose was brought against the threat that was faced from the Soviet Union. So they were an exceptional group of people. But it was also the concept they had of being a senator. They took the pledge to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. But there was what I would call an unwritten pledge. And the unwritten pledge was this: you're giving me this venerable title, you're giving me 6 years in the Senate and usually multiple terms. I can range wide over all the issues and I can drill deep on the ones that I care about. And in return for that privilege, when I sort out the pressures on me, I'm a member of a party, I represent a state, but what really matters is the national interest. That's what I'm about. That was their North Star. John McCain's famous phrase on later years, country first. The things that I write about in the book, the things that get worked out, can only be explained by a view of what they were there for. They were there to serve the national interest. It's commonplace to say they would fight and squabble and differ and then go out to dinner, but it's all true. They had a tolerance of each other's views, and it was a demilitarized zone where partisanship was concerned. They had great differences, regional differences, ideological differences, but it wasn't partisan. And so they were able to solve problems. And the other thing that they had, if that was their concept of being a senator, they also had a concept of what the Senate was. It was a body supposed to take collective action. It wasn't just there for their individual agendas. It wasn't there to be an object, a vehicle for obstruction. You had to eventually come to conclusions. You voted up or down. So there were debates, and there were some filibusters, but they were relatively rare. And a lot of the things that got done without 60 votes because there'd been enough debate, and it was time to move on. And you can't understand that Senate without understanding, I think, Mike Mansfield, who was the longest-serving leader of the Senate. He came after Lyndon Johnson. Johnson's legendary. Robert Caro's book assures no one will ever forget Lyndon Johnson mastered the Senate. But Johnson was an abusive leader who used every carrot and stick at his disposal and twisted arms and necks and everything else. And he had pretty much worn out his welcome by the time he became vice president and left the Senate. Mansfield was completely different. He built a Senate based on mutual respect and trust. Bipartisanship radiated out of Mansfield because every morning he had breakfast with his best friend, who was George Aiken from Vermont, a Republican. The Senate that a lot of us served in was essentially a healthy ecosystem, basically. It was a place where the relationship of the Democrats and the Republicans, the senators and the staff, the leaders and the committees, it all made a lot of sense. It was a healthy place. And it was a magnet for many of us who wanted to go into public service, particularly Democrats who didn't want to go into the Nixon administration in the 60s and the 70s. And so I didn't know all these people at the time, but if you look at who was wandering around the Senate as young people, Bill Clinton was there, Stephen Breyer, Madeleine Albright, Tim Russert, Chris Matthews, Susan Collins, Lamar Alexander, Tom Daschle. There were a lot of people there who went on to be significant leaders. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said about the Civil War young, "To our great good fortune, in our youth we were touched by fire." We had the great good fortune of not going through the Civil War. But the experience of being young and working for these senators really made a difference. So I decided to write the book. And the lesson I will give people about writing a book is it's good to have a publisher. There's some great people writing great books out there, but if you don't have a publisher, it's like being in hell. But I got a publisher pretty early on. They liked the idea. So the publisher, after I'd convinced him to let me write the book, he was pretty much on board. And the publisher at the last meeting says to me, "Okay, 3 things about the book. Number 1, it's not a memoir. Nobody's interested in your memoirs." I said, "Can I pop up occasionally in the book?" He said, "Very occasionally, very rarely." Okay, so I can do that. The second thing was, it's not political science. You write narrative history. You tell the story. That's what people are interested in. That's what sells. And by the way, there's no evidence you can do that. We think you can write legal stuff. We think you can write policy stuff. I said, no, I can tell stories. I've been telling stories for years. Give me a chance, coach. And so they said, all right, we'll let you do that. But the third thing was, we don't want you trudging through 18 years of the Great Senate. It's too much. Find another way to tell the story. So I walked out of the meeting, and I had an agent, and my agent said, "You must be discouraged." I said, "No, actually I feel kind of liberated. The 18 years were getting kind of long to trudge through. How much could I add about the civil rights and Watergate and all the stuff that's been written about?" So I found another way to tell the story. And the story that I tell is the story of the last years of the Great Senate. It's America's 3rd century is beginning. There's a new outsider president, Jimmy Carter, and new Senate leaders, Robert Byrd and Howard Baker. And it's the messy stuff of everyday life, and it's a lot like the period we've gone through now, with a weak economy and difficult economic and energy problems and foreign policy crises. And Jimmy Carter last year said, Barack Obama is going through a lot of the same things that I went through, but I had one advantage that he didn't have. I had a bipartisan Congress. I had a Senate that I could work with, and that was an important difference. So without giving away the book or the stories of the book, let me just touch on a couple of things that illustrate the kind of courage and statesmanship that these people had. This is all in 1 year. It's in a 6-month period in 1978. Carter comes into the White House, and he's not easy to deal with. He doesn't like politics. He doesn't like politicians. He doesn't like Congress. But he's not easy to deal with. He decides we're going to negotiate a new treaty with Panama over access to the canal. And he tells Howard Baker, the new Republican leader, and Byrd, the Democratic leader. And Baker told me, I'll never forget my reaction. This was a very unwelcome development. He said, why now and why me? This has been kicking around for years. Baker's staff comes to him and says, Senator, if you do this, you will never be nominated for the presidency by the Republican Party. The party's all against this. Ronald Reagan just almost beat Gerald Ford running on the Panama Canal opposition. And Baker knows that. And Baker says, basically, yeah, but what's the national interest? What's the right thing to do? Well, you got to get a couple of assurances from the Panamanians about access, etc. He says, yeah, but if we get those, what's the right thing to do? Well, of course you should do it. That's the right thing to do. And that's what Howard Baker does. He never gets nominated for the presidency, but he gets the Panama Canal treaties through by 1 vote. On the Democratic side, Frank Church of Idaho, a great opponent of the Vietnam War, is facing a difficult re-election 2 years later, and his staff says, you can't be for this. They hate it in Idaho. It's the most conservative state in the country. And Church says, but it's everything that I believe in terms of how we should define our relationships with the developing world. And so his staff says, okay, vote for it, but don't be very visible. He takes the lead on it. He takes the lead for weeks and weeks, and 2 months on the floor, he takes the lead on it. That's what they were there for. That's how they saw their job. That's the national interest. So I'll give a second example. This is the next month. New York City is facing a financial problem. They had gotten some help from Congress in 1975, but only seasonal loans, and they need more help. They're never going to get back on their feet or on the path to prosperity without more help. But the Senate Banking Committee has already said, no more money for New York. William Proxmire of Wisconsin, a famed skinflint who hated spending money, was the chairman of the committee. And he's opposed to it. They're all opposed to it. And there's a tax revolt that's rolling in from California with Proposition 13. So everybody's opposed to it. But Proxmire says, but I'll give New York the chance to make their case. And New York comes in with a new mayor, Ed Koch, a great governor, Hugh Carey, and 2 senators who were the best urban senators perhaps that ever lived, Jacob Javits and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And they turn the Senate around. They make the case and they turn the Senate around. They don't persuade Proxmire, but he won't stop it because that's what the Senate wants to do. But still, they're afraid of creating a precedent that would be bad. They don't want every city coming in for money. So Richard Lugar, who's a new senator at that time, just newly elected, says, I'll come up with something that's such tough love that nobody will come in for it again. And he comes up with a tough love package that helps New York, and nobody ever comes in again. And New York's prosperity, its return to prosperity, dates back to that time. They listened to each other. They figured out problems. They were very much in the mode of improving on what the president was doing. And they were like a championship team in a way. Might be a bad day to mention that, but they were like a championship team in that different players would step up when it was needed. They would come through with big plays. Last example. Energy was the dominant issue of the late 70s. Carter was trying to get a national energy policy. The chairman of the Energy Committee was Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson of Washington, very powerful senator. Jackson and Carter hate each other. Carter had defeated Jackson for the nomination. Carter's staff disrespected Jackson. They hate each other. You read their books, they hated each other. Jackson works every day for 3 years to put in place the energy policy. He respected the presidency, if not the president. He saw the need for the national policy. The personal animus didn't enter into it. That's the way they did things. Okay, so hopefully by now, I've convinced you that it's an interesting book, interesting history. But we're within 2 weeks of a big election, and certainly the Senate that I talked about then is a lot different than the Senate now. So you might be saying, it's interesting history, but what's the relevance of the book? I'm glad you asked me that question. Because I think it has a lot of relevance. I think it's relevant to the election, and I think it's relevant to how we govern ourselves. It's relevant because the central question in this election, I think, comes down to whether Barack Obama has done as much as he should have. Has he been as successful as he should have been as president? Was he naive or arrogant to think he could transform our politics and didn't do it? Washington's still broken. And I would say that if President Obama was naive, it's because he believed in the national story we tell each other, that Americans come together in times of crisis. He became president at an absolute moment in crisis, a national economic crisis, the worst in 80 years, 2 wars on. He was entitled to think he would get some cooperation from the minority party. That's how our system works. We're not a parliamentary system. He got no cooperation. From day one, it was total, utter obstruction. And I choose my words carefully because rhetoric is too shrill in our politics anyway. But I'd say total opposition to the president because you want to defeat him right after he's been elected, in a time of national economic crisis, that's a pretty good definition of unpatriotic. And so I think that from my standpoint, and I'm a partisan Democrat in that regard, although the book's not partisan, Obama was counting on having the kind of Senate that we used to have, and we don't have it anymore. The distance between Howard Baker, the Republican leader then, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader now, is like the Grand Canyon. It's like completely different. So the Republicans prevented the stimulus. The Senate Republicans kept the stimulus to a certain size. They virtually ostracized Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe because they were going to vote for it. They opposed health care completely, even when a couple of the members were trying to work it out with Democrats. They did the same thing on financial regulation. Bob Corker of Tennessee, a Republican, was working on this financial regulation because, in case we hadn't noticed, Wall Street had abused our trust. And there was a need for financial regulation to do something about these banks. So Corker's working away on this. And one day, he gets summoned by his leaders. And they say, basically, you didn't get the memo. We're not trying to work this out. We're not trying to give him a victory. We're trying to defeat him. And that's the way it's been. That's not the way it used to be. And it's pretty serious stuff because our system depends on a loyal opposition and minority cooperation. And so the question becomes, if I'm accurate, when did it change? What happened and how do we get it back to what it used to be? The reason this is important, I think, is that the Senate at its best is the world's greatest deliberative body. But it hasn't been at its best for about 20 years. At its worst, it's our most vulnerable political institution, easily paralyzed, as we've seen. The bitterness of the House, coupled with the arcane rules of the Senate. You can't do much worse than that. So we've seen the Senate at its worst. We've seen the world's greatest legislative body become the empty chamber, in the words of George Packer in The New Yorker. So here's the connection between the presidential campaign and the Senate, the other connection. I'm strongly for Barack Obama. There's no question about that. Whoever is elected president, we won't have a functional government unless we restore the Senate. Unless the Senate, if not the next great Senate, at least has to be respectable. We can't run the government without a Senate that actually works. It used to be what Walter Mondale called our national mediator, where things got worked out. It wasn't the place where things got paralyzed. So, how did we get here and how do we get out? How we got here is, I think, fairly clear. The 1980 election, when Ronald Reagan was elected and swept in a lot of neophyte Republicans, that shattered the great Senate. The Republicans that came in and replaced Nelson and Bayh and Muskie and Javits and all the people that either lost, McGovern, all the people that lost or retired, the Republicans that came in were basically neophytes with no experience. Many of them arrived with no accomplishments and left 6 years later with their records intact. But the story wasn't done yet. The story wasn't done yet because there was still a lot of good senators there. And it kind of got rolling again, people working together, enough good senators. And by the mid-'80s, Senate looked sort of like it used to look. Not quite as great, but it was doing the work of the country. In the 1990s, it changed and it started down. And it's been going down for close to 20 years. It changed when Newt Gingrich took over the House, and Newt Gingrich's friends, led by Trent Lott, took over the Senate. Alan Simpson of Wyoming, who's still in the news for Simpson Bowls, told me, the Senate changed when the battered children from the House came over, led by Trent Lott. There was so much viciousness and partisanship in the House, they carried it over to the Senate, and the culture of the Senate changed. And somebody said to me, you're pretty hard on Trent Lott. You know, you blame him for a lot of stuff. I said, well, I used the best evidence I could. I took his memoir, and he said how much he hated the Senate when he got there. He was determined to change it, and he changed it very quickly, actually. And a lot of the moderates, particularly the Republican moderates, left in 1996. So it's been going down for a long time. So can there be a next great Senate, or at least a respectable one? It's easier to be pessimistic than optimistic. Michigan's own, University of Michigan's own Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, two great scholars about Congress, wrote a book recently which is entitled, It's Worse Than You Think. And so I've decided to carve out a different position for myself. That's too bleak. I consider myself an optimist, but only compared to Norm and Tom. I think that there's no doubt that we have a vitriolic political culture, and we all know the elements of it. We understand the demands of fundraising, and particularly after the Citizens United case. We know the 24-hour media and the combative nature of it has changed the political conversation. Facebook and Twitter have changed the political conversation. A lobbying corps that has grown 5 times in the last 20 years, it's 5 times as big. That has an effect on the senators. Everything has changed. I never say that it's easy to be a senator. It's harder than it used to be. Everything has changed. But that doesn't mean that the senators shouldn't behave like senators, focused on the national interest, working together on collective action. The only reason I'm a relative optimist, relative to Norm and Tom, is that I've spoken to a lot of the senators, and I find they're as angry and frustrated with the Senate as the public is. Somebody said to me, the senators must hate your book because you obviously love the old Senate and you don't think much of their Senate. I said, they don't think much of their Senate. They all agree with me, Democrats and Republicans. They don't think they were sent to Washington to reflect all of our differences and inflame those differences. A lot of them actually think they should be reconciling those differences. My sympathy for them only extends to a certain point. If that's the way they feel, they should do something about it. They act as if they're trapped in the hyper-partisan Senate that has evolved. But in fact, they have the power to change things. They could change their failed leaders. That would be helpful. They could change the Senate rules to make the filibusters, again, rare. You know, you could have filibusters occasionally, but not every day. You could abolish holds so that one senator couldn't hold up nominations and legislation indefinitely. There are things you could do to change it. And above all, they should change their attitudes. They should go back to being senators. And when they do that, as they did in the lame duck session in 2010, just 2 years ago, some of the Republicans broke with their leader. And the treatment of gays and lesbians in the military changed. 13 Republican senators followed Richard Lugar, and the START treaty, nuclear arms treaty, passed the Senate. When they know how to do it. That's the thing that's frustrating about it. The reason I dislike the leadership of Senator McConnell so much is I think it's extremely cynical leadership. He actually understands the Senate. He gave an interview not that long ago in which he said, you know, sometimes you have to be a statesman. Sometimes you have to rise above partisanship and the interests of your state. You know, sometimes you've got to be ready to step up and make history. Well, there's been a lot of history that could have been made in the last 4 years. And all he's been is total obstruction. So that kind of cynicism, I think, is something that I have a great deal of difficulty with. Now, some people, I was speaking once recently and someone said, you seem to think the senators should rise above the vitriolic political culture. I said, yes, that's exactly what I seem to think. I think they should rise above it. I think that's what they're supposed to be doing. That's what they were elected to do. I mean, a few of them were elected to obstruct, but not most of them. That's supposed to rise above it. And the reason I think it's so important is that we've got to cut into the problem somewhere. When I look at our political system, I can think of 10, we could all think of 10 things that ought to change. But they'll take years, if at all. We're not going to change the finances, campaign finance system again. We're not going to be able to put the 24-hour media back in the bottle. There's a lot of things we won't be able to do. Senators can change. The people that are there can change. The people that join them can change. And they can make a difference. I said to somebody recently that a lot of the audiences I look out at who are nice enough to come to these talks, there are many of my contemporaries, people that remember the great senators and people that have a little time, some retired, etc. I wrote the book for the next generation. I really wanted my kids to understand that it wasn't that long ago that we had a government that actually worked. It's not impossible. I was with Howard Baker actually 2 days ago at the Baker Center. Howard Baker's 87, and he's not in good shape, but he came and stayed for the whole talk, and his wife, Nancy Casselbaum Baker, was with him. He was quoted by somebody as saying, "Our system doesn't require great individual statesmen." And I was struck by that, because I think great individual statesmen and great senators are very helpful. But I realized that Howard Baker had a point, because if you go through the current list of senators, they're not great. They're not great. But there are a lot of people up there that are pretty capable. They could actually do the job if they freed themselves of this partisan model and stopped handing their votes to the party leaders. So I wrote the book for my kids, and hopefully for your kids. And I feel strongly that the men and women who are up there today have the great privilege of being senators. They walk where the greats walked. And they've got to lift their game. They've got to be like the great senators. They owe it to us, and we actually should hold them to it. So I thank you for coming and love to take questions. And I'm reminded the mic is in the back, and you're quite close to it.
One question. What are the ramifications of the Senate, where they have been doing until recently inside trading that was reported? Second, the fact that 35% of Congress are millionaires. And third, that the whole, they just reported this today, the whole procedure of during the election, where there's millions and millions of dollars that are coming, which is questionable. Is that the way we should be raising money to elect people?
Well, I think it certainly isn't the way we should be raising money. I think the campaign finance system was out of control before Citizens United Supreme Court decision, and now it's even worse. And I think the ramifications of it are that it's very hard for people who are not rich, increasingly hard for people who are not rich to run for office, on the one hand. And frankly, more and more people will turn away from running. So we have to try to make the public service worthwhile, and we have to change these other aspects of it. I didn't mention, and it was left out of my resume because my resume was too long, the main factor of my career at this point. It can be described best as long. I ran for office 10 years ago for Congress, and it was a great campaign that everyone was involved in, and I had some very good opponents, and I felt pretty good about it. I thought I could help make a difference. I don't know, looking at it again, whether I would feel the same way 10 years later. And if people get discouraged from putting themselves forward, that's a real problem.
Yes, first of all, I'd just like to thank you for being able to do what many authors cannot do, and that's present a huge number of facts, but in a very flowing, readable style. And in case you haven't read the book yet, I'm sure you'll have the moments like I had where I was like, oh, I'd forgotten about that. Burt Lance nomination, for example, and things like that.
Most normal people have forgotten about that.
So in your epilogue, you sort of answered one question that I had, in that what senators today would be equivalent to Baker and Church as who put the national interest first. And you mentioned Collins and Snow. And I just wonder, are there any others on your list, and especially since they're Republicans, any Democrats that you can see who rise above the partisanship?
Oh, yeah. No, I think I'm personally fond of him, and I've known him since he got to the Senate in 1979. I think Carl Levin's a great senator. I think that And I will say, because I've known him that long, he's never changed in the sense he's never become, for a moment, arrogant in any way. He's the same person he was when he came, and that's not easy to do when you're as powerful as he is. It's no accident that he was a leading opponent of the Iraq War, and probably the only person who's really tried to come to grips with what Goldman Sachs has done. So Carl Levin is like that. Regrettably, Dick Lugar was certainly a great senator. I think people joke occasionally about John Kerry because he's been with us for so long, but I think Kerry has been an excellent senator, and I think he's been a very good chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Look, I think McCain, prior to 2008, was a great senator by anybody's measure. So there are some. Some of the younger ones, Mark Warner from Virginia and Mike Bennett from Colorado, these are people who really have potential. It's funny, though, what I said about the ecosystem, I wrote the whole book and didn't think of it, but the fundamental notion when I started making the talks was these senators today aren't in a healthy ecosystem. My state of Maryland, we used to have Paul Sarbanes and Mac Mathias, who were really good senators. We have really good senators now in Ben Cardin and Barbara Mikulski. But it's hard to be a really successful senator in a Senate that doesn't work.
Just one comment, which is I came planning to hear your lecture, but not buy the book, and you've convinced me I have to buy and read the book.
I think this is a person of great wisdom. I mean, really. Thank you. By the way, authors love signing books. Somebody told me that there is something called e-books, and for people that don't like signed books, it's an e-book too.
I'll go with the paper. It seems to me that one of the things that has corrupted politics locust in the state and in the nation is the 15-second, 30-second attack ad, because so much of what goes on in legislative bodies today, it seems to me, is setting up the other people by raising an issue which you don't expect to win on, you don't even care if you win on, but you can make the other fellow look bad, and then use that in 35 districts around the country or around the state and defeat that person on that basis. By simplifying it, by oversimplifying it.
Right.
It's just one more toxic element of the culture.
No, I agree. And not to go back to my book, but but actually, one reason I enjoyed and found it valuable to write about the period I did. The toxic political culture we live in today was born in about 6 months in 1978. In a 6-month period in 1978, the tax revolt came in and has colored our tax debate ever since. The special single interest PACs had their first impact in 1978. Grassroots lobbying on the Panama Canal Treaty and on labor law reform took a new form at that time. For the first time, I was picking up on your point, it was really the first time that issues were raised not because they were national agenda issues, but because they were political issues. You wanted to keep them as political issues. My book has many heroes and not that many villains. Jesse Helms is a villain in my book because Helms actually was one of the first masters of raising issues simply to get people on the record and then going out and raising money and creating a national fundraising apparatus to try to defeat them. The Senate that I worked in was strong enough to resist that for a while, but ultimately it took its toll even on the Senate.
Thank you for kind of introducing me to this new kind of great Senate. but I'm more familiar with the Senate kind of, the great Senate that I think of is with Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and kind of in those, the mid-19th century, that kind of in the antebellum Senate that kind of resolved lots of issues and held off the Civil War for so many years. Did you ever compare this great Senate to that great Senate and how they operated and how they were?
Perhaps not as much as I should have. I was pretty focused more on the 20th century. Certainly, the Senate I describe, which I once said is, I call it the last great Senate, might be the first great Senate, or the only great Senate of the 20th century. It's possible, certainly, to think back on the Senate from 1820 to 1850. It had some great members in it, without question, and they did, to the extent, they clearly had some effect in delaying the Civil War. So I guess mine is the second great Senate.
In the book, you contrasted the leadership styles of Mansfield and Byrd, for example. How would you characterize Reed's leadership style, and how effective do you think he is as a leader? Can he lead us back toward the great Senate?
I don't. I don't think Senator Reed is a particularly good leader. I have a great deal of respect and sympathy for what he's been dealing with. Senator Reed was trying to get through a legislative program and dealing with unprecedented obstruction by Senator McConnell and the Republicans. So I think that I do have sympathy for him. I don't think the Senate is likely to change unless we had different leaders, but we'll see what happens. I would say that McConnell's a very good Republican leader. He's just not a very good Senate leader, because that requires different things. Sometimes when he talks, I think he should be running the Republican National Committee, but not the Senate.
You mentioned that there's a bad political culture in the Senate that wasn't there in the past. I noticed in your talk that you mentioned mostly that it started when Republicans came into power in what had been a mostly Democratic club prior to 1980. That's an observation. Also, can you tell me about how much the Senate has been affected by that, and the Senate has, I've noticed, had a lot more nominees have been held up by both ones that Republican presidents have nominated and the other way around.
Well, I think that I once said it sometimes reminds me of the scene in West Side Story when they're out, the Sharks and the Jets are out in front of Doc's candy store, and they start arguing about who started it. The politicians are the same way. Well, Bob Bork, John Tower, they just go through these fights. Newt Gingrich, Jim Wright. I think a fair way to look at it is that both parties have contributed to a changed politics, but the Republican inexorable move to the right has changed things more, basically. And I think that's an accurate way to look at it. I think that that's a way that reflects what John Danforth and Alan Simpson and Bill Cohen and Susan Collins and a lot of people think. But I was with Tom Daschle at the Kennedy Library recently, and Tom said he regretted the proliferation of separate Democratic and Republican caucuses in the Senate. Lunches. He was referring to lunches. They used to have these lunches periodically, but they didn't have them every week or twice a week, where each side goes to its own group and they sort of jazz themselves up and they come out fighting. He compares that with the amount of time that people used to spend together. It's a much different situation. They really used to spend a lot of time together on the floor, off the floor, eating lunch together, eating dinner together. They had, Hubert Humphrey and Barry Goldwater had nothing they agreed on substantively, but they were great friends. They spent a lot of time together.
There was an earlier question regarding millionaires in the Senate, and I think the question was there are 35 out of the 100. Relating to that, it troubles me, to the least, that so many people come into the office of the Senate with self-serving financial purposes, and they walk out as millionaires when they did not arrive that way. And many of those go on to be lobbyists, and the laws regarding lobbying are pretty much ignored. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, I think it is a problem that senators do go on to go be lobbyists. I think that I'm not exactly sure that they're getting rich in office, frankly. A lot of them are coming to office rich already.
May I just interject? Denny Hastert came in as a gym teacher and a coach. He's worth millions due to inside information about property.
Well, and I didn't respond adequately to that earlier question. Look, insider trading and inside information ought to be unacceptable. I mean, that doesn't deal with the question of the fact that there are simply too many rich people who are getting into office. But, you know, I think it's a very valid concern. Somebody made the point recently that Washington is not adequately responsive to the economic problems in the country because too many of the people there don't have any economic problems. They're doing pretty well, and their kids are doing pretty well. And oftentimes they're not conscious of people the way they should be. Now, that depends who you're talking about. Certainly those people, the members of Congress still work very hard. They get back in their districts. They do see a lot of people, and they do understand, I think, what's going on. But there's some separation that has happened, I think.
When candidates run for office, so often they say, you know, these are the changes I want to make, and I'm going to try to pass this legislation. And the question I have is, I mean, does it really add to our quality of life? Why is it necessary for them to pass that many new laws? You know, just so that they can say, well, I've done this and that. I mean, I understand there are important things to do, such as working on the national budget, but they don't seem to be completing those tasks. It's sometimes often more minor, unimportant legislation that's passed. So could you comment on that, please?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that need to be done. I mean, they're not doing enough of them, but, you know, there's legislation on things like food safety, for instance, or transportation infrastructure. There are a lot of things that need to be done that aren't sort of the top three things you would think about. So, you know, my objection is that they're not getting enough of the things done that they need to. You know, if you look around the world, I think what you find is every government, particularly in the advanced economies, they're all under pressure. They're all dealing with some of the difficult problems of how do you grow an economy on the one hand while you're trying to control your debt? How do you deal with your demographic issues that are driving health care costs up? Governments are having trouble everywhere. And there's something out there also has to do with technology. I can't exactly say how it has to do with it because people are always thinking about it, but technology brings us a lot of things, but it has sharpened inequality. I think around the world you can see inequality rising in almost every country. And from my standpoint, if that's happening, public policy should be leaning against it. We shouldn't have public policy that ignores it or makes it worse. So that if you've got inequality rising and then you're also cutting taxes for the top bracket, you know, that's not the kind of policy we should be pursuing.
The final question.
You mentioned a lot of good senators.
You've got the final question.
All right.
Except we occasionally answer questions outside.
But there are two that appear on the cover of the book that you did not mention. One is Ed Muskie, and the other one is Senator Jacob Javits of New York. And I'm particularly interested about Senator Jacob Javits because his wife, as you recall, was involved in some kind of a scandal involving consulting services and money and stuff like that. So would you mind to comment on that?
I think his wife had worked with the Iranian government at that time, the Shah.
That's where I'm from.
Yeah, right. And I think she then resigned at that point under pressure. From my standpoint, and I think I talked to a lot of people, I had some bias because I interned for him in the beginning. Everyone I spoke to thought that Javits was one of the great senators, absolutely at the top. The smartest of them, the best lawyer, the best debater. You'll read in the profile of Javits, I think, the fact that he could walk into a third committee meeting in the same morning and cut to the heart of an issue even if he hadn't been there. So I think he was a great legislator, and I don't think he was affected by the fact that his wife had... Look, the truth of the matter is the United States government for a long time, presidents of both parties and Congress stuck with the Shah for too long. And we've paid a price for it for a long time, just as we paid a price for overthrowing the previous government. But we probably won't solve the Iranian problem tonight.
Ed Muskie was the other one.
Well, Muskie's on the cover of the book because I think he was a great senator. I'll tell one quick story about how Muskie became a great senator. Muskie was another of these party builders who came back from World War II, and he built the Democratic Party in Maine. And he was the governor of Maine, and then he got elected to the Senate. He was a very proud and prickly person. And he came to the Senate, and Lyndon Johnson started to patronize him. And Johnson apparently said to him at one time, "Ed, you just wait till the M's are called, and then you can decide how to vote." And Johnson said it in a way that, "I'll tell you how to vote." So a vote came up early on, and Johnson said, "How are you going to vote?" And Muskie said, "Well, I just thought I'd wait till the M's come up, Mr. Leader." And he wouldn't give him the vote. Johnson got mad at Muskie and started calling him chicken shit, which was basically Johnson's all-purpose term for people he didn't like. But that was a time when Senate leaders had real power. So Johnson gave Muskie the three worst committees he could think of. One of them was the Public Works Committee, and Muskie got into the environmental issues because he was put on that committee. It was the time that Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring. Concern about the environment started, and Ed Muskie became a great environmentalist because Lyndon Johnson stuck him on that committee. Anyway, thank you very much. Okay?
Well, Ira, thank you very much for an interesting and informative presentation. We appreciate you fitting us into your hectic schedule. To commemorate your visit to the Ford Library, we have a special gift featuring not one, but two pens with Gerald Ford's signature, which, by the way, are really excellent instruments for signing books. So I do that.
That's
And
great.
Thank you all for the great questions and for coming out on World Series tonight. I'm very impressed by that. Before we adjourn, I just have 3 quick items. Quick reminder about our next program, which is coming up on Wednesday, November 14th, after Election Day. And we are featuring Sasha Isenberg on that date, author of the Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. So come in, and he'll help you make sense of what the heck actually happened. Second, I invite you to join Friends of Ford, and I dropped my flyer. We do have applications and help support programs such as this. I myself am a card-carrying Friends of Ford member, and I am enjoying lots of perks, including free admission to the Ford Museum and other presidential museums administered by the National Archives. And that was an unsolicited testimonial. And lastly, if you would like to receive email announcements of upcoming programs, we have another form which you can fill out, and we have those available outside in our lobby. Now, the part you've all been waiting for, I invite you to meet our speaker, get your book signed, and enjoy our reception. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for the pen.
Oh, you're welcome.
That's great.
Great job.